the key thing about the Franklin method, it's about understanding your body and improving your body's function. So I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose you. But what I love about the Franklin method is that although we all have different bodies, they are a very similar structure, and the function of them is very similar. It might differ a little bit to varying degrees with, you know, how the bones sit into each other or slightly different muscular attachments. But the whole premise of the Franklin method is when you embody function, when you practice good function, you improve good function. So if we practice good function of the bones in the pelvis, it's going to improve the function of the bones in the pelvis. It stands to reason, doesn't it? It makes total sense. If you practice good function of the muscles, you are going to improve the function of the muscles. The bladder is a muscle. I think that's just one thing that's really nice to know. That's to start there straight away. So the bladder is a muscle. So this is the shape of your bladder. It's a tetrahedron. So it's a triangle shape on all sides when it's empty. So it's like a kind of flattened tetrahedron when it's empty. And it lives just behind your pubic bone. So we have the pelvis here and all the amazing, beautiful pelvic floor muscles. We're going to be looking in particular at 2 different sets of pelvic floor muscles today. Another time, if you decided to do the 3-week course, then we can look at all of them. But there's going to be this particular one here that is underneath the bladder. That's what we're going to be looking at. And then we're going to be looking at the urethral sphincter. But the bladder sits just behind the pubic bone here. And when it's empty, it's just got its kind of little nose just kind of popping up just there. And then when it's full, it gets bigger, obviously, and it becomes more oval shaped, more like a ball. And it literally it rises up behind the pubic bone. So when it's empty, it drops down. And then when it's more full, it's more oval or round, like a ball, and it lifts up. So it's a muscle. So just take a moment with that, just to imagine that, and even to almost sense that within your own body. We'll do lots of embodiment as the class goes on, but just have a sense of, okay, my bladder is just behind my pubic bone. You might even just want to feel that my pubic bone is there. My bladder is just behind it. If your bladder is at all full, you can feel it. And if it's empty, you possibly can't feel it because it's just dropped down below, but it's a muscle. And it's actually layers and layer upon layer of muscle. So just see if you can image that for a moment. My bladder is a muscle. My bladder is a muscle. When the bladder is empty, the muscle fibers of the bladder, they all kind of slide together. It's more of, I suppose it's more like a concentric contraction. They've all slid together. It's smaller. Can I ask you maybe all to do that? So just slide your fingers together. So that would be the bladder when it's smaller, when it's empty. And then when it gets bigger, so when it fills, the muscle fibers slide apart, and it gives the appearance that it's stretching. So it's becoming bigger. The muscles aren't really stretching. The fibers are just sliding apart. And then if you sit down and have a wee, then the muscle fibers would slide together. Why don't we just try that a couple of times? So just do it in slow motion. Your kidneys send urine down to your bladder. It just trickles down constantly, about every 10 to 15 seconds, like a little trickle of urine. So over the hour, it's going to get a little bit bigger. The muscle fibers start to slide apart. They slide apart a little bit more. And it's not just this direction, it would be this direction. It would be a multitude of directions, kind of a irregular shape muscle fibers, so that it's getting bigger in every direction, eccentrically lengthening, like a little bit like a stretch, I suppose. And then, okay, it's time to have a wee, and it would be, it contracts, concentrically contracts. And it's kind of squeezing it all out in every direction. Yeah, just try that one last time, just for that kind of embodiment of it. So my bladder would get bigger as it fills over the hour or 2 hours. It will get bigger, This is a muscle that's lengthening. Then it's full. And it's usually around, well, anywhere between 300 mils to even up to 700 mils that it can be fill with of urine. And then, okay, it's time to have a wee, to urinate, and it all squeezes together. Squeeze. And just imagine that it can fully empty. So we're going to look at that a little bit later on when it comes to the sphincters. But again, I just want to draw or create another more clearer picture of the bladder and what is surrounding it. So just see if you can imagine this shaped bladder inside of your pelvis. It has muscular support from underneath. So we've got a set of muscles called the levator ani, and they're like a hammock-like muscle, and they support the bladder from underneath. We're not going to be looking at those so much today. We're going to be looking more at another set of muscles, which are a triangular set of muscles, and they are also below, and they're like an extra reinforcement for the bladder and also for the uterus and the vagina. So we've got an extra support here, and then below that, we've got the sphincters. So I just want to give you a sense of below the bladder, we have this hammock muscle, we have this triangular muscle, and then we have sphincters within and around that. So just a sense of that. But also below the bladder, we have, I'm going to see if I can find a picture. I took some photos earlier. We've got a lovely big ligament that is underneath here that comes round the neck of the bladder, and it attaches into the sides of the pelvis. I'll give you a few names because I know there are a few Franklin Method educators watching, and sometimes it's helpful to have names. If you're not a Franklin Method educator, you do not need to know the names, but I think it's just nice to have the imagery. So we've got this lovely big ligament that attaches, that supports here underneath the bladder and around the neck. And it comes off and it attaches into the tendinous arc of the levator ani. Are you familiar with that muscle, Deanna? Yeah, so you've done that one. I'm just going to show you one here. So we've got, where are we here? So it'll be along there. Basically, that tendinous arc is like a thickening of your obturator internus, which is a glute muscle. It's a hip muscle. And I just think that this is really fascinating that the ligament, one of the ligaments that supports the bladder from underneath, attaches into this fascia, which is part of your glutes. And it just, for me, it just shows that it's, the bladder is not an island. It is also supported by the glutes. So the function of your glutes or the well-being of your glutes is going to affect your bladder. So if you're having bladder issues, it could potentially be linked to the glutes. And if we can improve the function of the glutes, it could potentially improve bladder function. It's one of the pieces. So it's not very often that you could say, I have this issue, it's because of this, because there's so many things that have happened to us throughout our lives. It could be many, many things. But if instead of just wondering where it came from, let's just look at improving the function of all of these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. And then it doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's improved. So this is one of the pieces. We can look at this obturator, this glute muscle, to see if that can improve the function of that support from underneath the bladder. Okay. I might see if I can find a photo of that later. So we have a lovely ligament that's underneath that helps to support the bladder as well as the muscles. We have a ligament at the front called the pubovesical ligament, and that attaches from the front of the bladder to the pubic bone. So you have this kind of sense of lift and support from the front. And then above, and this is really lovely, you have the umbilical ligament. So there's a big thickening of connective tissue, ligament, that is on top of here. And it comes up and it meets the abdominal wall and it attaches into your belly button. So your belly button is connected to your bladder by this umbilical ligament. So it's also then thinking, okay, well, the state of my belly button or the condition of my abdominals or the function of my abdominals, that's also going to affect my bladder. So if any of these things are over tight, that is not going to help with positioning of bladder. If any of these things are not functioning as well as they could be, that's going to affect that whole ecosystem. So instead of being overwhelmed, because I know this is a lot of words and a lot of ideas, but I think actually it's quite empowering to think, oh, there's lots of ways that I can support my bladder function. It's not just doing a Kegel exercise. I can actually really work on the conditioning of my abdominals. I can work on the conditioning of my glutes, and I can work on the conditioning of my pelvic floor. Have I started at a really fast pace, or is this okay? Okay, this is okay. Yeah, so just to recap, we have this tetrahedron that turns into a more oval shape. and it sits inside the pelvis, and it rises up when it's full and it lowers down when it's emptier. It's muscle, and that muscle eccentrically lengthens when the bladder becomes more full, and then it concentrically contracts when the bladder needs to be emptied. We'll embody that a little bit later on with the sphincters. This bladder is supported by the hammock. It's supported by a triangular set of muscles. There's sphincters around the urethra. And it's also supported by this ligament that's underneath, the ligament that's at the front, and then the ligament that is at the top. So you don't just have to grip your sphincters to lift your bladder. You can imagine all of this beautiful support from elsewhere. Okay, I think that's the introduction done. Let's jump up and see if we can embody what we have just learnt.